The apple pie sits on Dad's kitchen counter like an apology I never asked to make. Steam still rises from the lattice crust, golden, perfect, ordinary. I baked it at 4 this morning because that's what the oldest daughter does. Shows up, brings dessert, pretends the last decade didn't happen. Evelyn. Mom's voice carries that forced brightness she reserves for awkward moments. You made it, I made it. As if driving 20 minutes across Minneapolis required heroic effort. As if I hadn't attended every birthday, every holiday, every family gathering for the past 10 years. Present but not participating. Watching from the edges of my own bloodline. The dining room buzzes with conversation. Dad's 70th birthday brings out the good china, the expensive wine, the kind of laughter that fills space without meaning anything. My sister Claire adjusts her pearls and smooths her designer dress. My brother Trevor checks his Rolex again. Even Mom changed out of her gardening clothes into something that screams successful family matriarch. Then there's me, jeans, flannel shirt, boots that have seen actual work. Still unemployed Evie, Trevor's voice cuts through the chatter like a blade wrapped in silk. He doesn't look up from his phone, but his smirk is audible. Even the cashier at Target has a name badge. The room doesn't quite silence, but conversations pause. That split second where everyone pretends they didn't hear while simultaneously leaning in to catch my response. Dad chuckles, not malicious, just thoughtless. At least they know her name. My name is Evelyn Ward. I'm the oldest daughter. The one who vanished from their expectations a decade ago when I stopped explaining myself. Stopped defending choices they couldn't understand. Stopped trying to translate a life they'd already decided didn't matter. They think I failed. But I never asked them to measure me. I cut the pie in silence. Perfect triangles on Mom's best plates. The knife moves steady, controlled. Each slice deliberate. I learned precision from practice, not from trying to impress anyone in this room. Remember when you were going to change the world? Claire's voice carries that particular sisterly combination of affection and pity. All those policy papers you wrote in college. What happened to that girl? What happened to that girl? As if I died instead of grew up. As if choosing silence meant choosing surrender. I place a slice in front of Dad. He doesn't meet my eyes, but he nods. Thanks without words. We've perfected this dance over the years' polite distance disguised as family tradition. Maybe she'll figure it out eventually, Trevor says. Finally looking up from his phone. Dad figured out the hardware store. Claire figured out real estate. I figured out development. Everyone finds their thing. Their thing. As if purpose comes with a LinkedIn profile and a business card. As if contribution only counts when it's visible to people who stopped looking years ago. The pie tastes like childhood, like Sunday mornings when Mom still believed I'd marry a lawyer and host dinner parties in a house with a white picket fence. Before I learned that some walls are built to keep people out and others are built to keep yourself in. You know what your problem is, Dad settles back in his chair, wine making him philosophical. You never learned to sell yourself. Success is about presentation, sweetheart. About making people remember your name. Making people remember your name. The irony sits heavy in my chest, but I don't laugh. Don't correct him. Don't explain that some names are better left unspoken at family dinners. Through the window, I notice the black SUV pulling into the driveway. Government plates, tinted windows. The kind of vehicle that doesn't belong in suburban Minneapolis on a Sunday evening. 2 figures emerge. Dark suits, earpieces. They move with purpose, scanning the neighborhood before approaching the front door. The doorbell rings. Conversation stops. Not the polite pause from before, but complete silence. Dad frowns. Mom smooths her hair. Trevor's phone finally goes face down on the table. Expecting someone, Claire asks. I'm not. But I recognize the walk, the scanning, the way they position themselves on either side of the door. Professional, federal, official. Mom opens the door and I see her step back. See her hand flutter to her throat. Ma'am, we're looking for Colonel Ward. The air changes, thickens. I feel every eye in the room turn toward me, but I'm already standing. Already moving toward the door with the kind of calm that comes from muscle memory. Colonel Ward. The shorter agent's voice is respectful, official. We're ready for your transport. The president is waiting. The president is waiting. Trevor's wine glass hits the floor. Crystal shatters against Mom's hardwood red, spreading across the boards like spilled secrets. Dad's mouth closes, opens again. No words. Claire's hand covers her mouth, but I can see her eyes wide, confused, calculating. Grandma starts to cry. Quiet tears that run down her cheeks while she stares at me like I'm a stranger who just walked into her kitchen wearing her granddaughter's face. "Give me 2 minutes," I tell the agents. They nod and step back. Professional courtesy. They've done this before. I turn back to my family, my father with his open mouth, my brother with wine stains on his shirt, my mother gripping the door frame like it might steady a world that just shifted off its axis. "Thank you for dinner," I say. "The pie was good." And I walk toward the door, toward the SUV, toward the life they never knew I was living. Behind me, I hear Trevor whisper, "What the hell just happened?" But I'm already gone. The SUV pulls away from the curb, and I watch Dad's house shrink in the side mirror. Through the tinted glass, I can see Trevor standing in the doorway, still holding his empty wine glass, still trying to piece together what just happened. He doesn't know that 23 years ago, I stopped trying to make sense for him. I was 22 then, senior year at the University of Minnesota urban policy major with a perfect GPA and a thesis on affordable housing that made professors stop in hallways to discuss implementation strategies. Harvard Kennedy School had already sent their acceptance letter. Full scholarship, research assistantship with Professor Martinez, who'd written the definitive text on municipal housing reform. I was going to change the world. At least that's what I told myself every morning when I walked across campus, briefcase in hand, future mapped out in color-coded planning calendars. The internship came through Professor Martinez. Competitive placement with Senator Richardson's office, the kind of opportunity that launched careers. 6 months in D.C., working directly with the Housing and Urban Development Liaison Team. Writing policy briefs, attending hearings, learning how legislation actually moved through the system. I packed my best suits and moved into a studio apartment 3 blocks from the Capitol, called home every Sunday to update the family on my progress. Dad would put me on speaker so everyone could hear about committee meetings and research projects. Mom would ask about my eating habits and whether I was making friends. "Are girls going places?" Dad would say after I hung up. I could hear the pride in his voice even through the phone static. The assault happened on a Tuesday in October, after a late hearing on appropriations when the office was mostly empty, except for senior staff finishing reports. David Henderson had been my supervisor for 3 months, deputy chief of staff 15 years on the Hill, married with twin daughters whose school photos sat on his desk between policy binders and coffee-stained legal pads. He'd been mentoring me, reviewing my drafts, teaching me how to navigate the unwritten rules of Washington. That Tuesday, he offered to drive me home. Said it was late for a young woman to be walking alone. Said he'd feel better knowing I got back safely. I trusted him, trusted the system. Trusted that powerful men who spoke eloquently about public service and social justice meant what they said. The attack lasted 12 minutes. I know because I watched the digital clock on his dashboard change from 11:47 to 11:59 while he held me down in the backseat of his sedan. 12 minutes that split my life into before and after. I reported it the next morning. Went through proper channels, filed paperwork, answered questions from investigators who took notes in government-issued notebooks, and spoke in measured tones about evidence and corroboration. The case was buried within a week. Insufficient evidence, the investigator explained. He said, she said. No witnesses, no physical evidence. Career-ending accusation against a respected public servant. David Henderson received a promotion 2 months later. Chief of Staff for the Senate Housing Subcommittee. I flew home for Thanksgiving carrying the secret like a stone in my chest. Sat at the same dining room table, where I'd eaten thousands of meals where homework had been checked, and report cards celebrated, and college applications filled out with careful precision. Mom asked about my internship. How were things going? Was I learning a lot? I told them everything. The assault, the investigation, the burial, the promotion. I laid it out like evidence in a courtroom waiting for their verdict. The silence lasted 30 seconds. 30 seconds of ticking from the kitchen clock while my family processed what I'd just said. Dad cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, looked at me with the expression he wore when reviewing hardware store receipts, calculating practical concern about bottom lines. "Evelyn," he said finally, "are you sure about this, about what you think happened? As if assault was a matter of interpretation. As if trauma could be fact-checked and found wanting." "Maybe there was some confusion," Mom added, her voice careful. "These political environments can be intense. Sometimes signals get mixed. As if I'd misunderstood being pinned down and violated. But it was Dad's next words that changed everything. "Let's not ruin his future over confusion, sweetheart. You're young, you'll recover, but an accusation like this, it destroys careers, destroys families. Think about his daughters. Not about their daughter sitting across from them with bruises still fading under her sweater. Think about the man who'd left those bruises." Trevor nodded agreement. "Dad's right. These things get blown out of proportion. You don't want to be known as that girl who makes accusations. That girl," as if seeking justice made me a type instead of a person. I left the table without finishing my pie. Drove back to Minneapolis the next morning while they were still sleeping. Withdrew from Harvard Kennedy the following week. Told my professors I was taking a different path. Didn't explain what path. Didn't explain anything to anyone. The walls went up slowly, not all at once, that would have been too obvious. Instead, I started editing my life. Stopped mentioning work, stopped sharing plans. Stopped asking for advice or support or understanding. I attended every family gathering, brought gifts, helped with dishes, smiled at appropriate moments. But I became a ghost in my own life, present but not participating, visible but not seen. They stopped asking questions after the first year, stopped trying to peek over walls I'd built so high that curiosity couldn't scale them. It was easier for everyone when I became the family mystery instead of the family disappointment. "What's Evelyn up to these days?" became a question with no answer. A conversational dead end that family friends learned to avoid. I finished my undergraduate degree in silence, started volunteering at shelters in silence, built a nonprofit in silence, joined the public health service in silence, earned my colonel's rank in silence. The silence wasn't shame. It was survival. It was the recognition that some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud, especially to people who've already decided they don't want to hear them. That was the day I learned survival came easier when you became invisible. Invisible to the family who'd taught me that protection meant protecting everyone except the person who needed it most. Invisible to the system that valued reputation over justice. Invisible to the world that measured worth by what it could see and understand and categorize. But invisible didn't mean powerless. It just meant selective about who got to witness the power. The SUV turns onto the highway, heading toward the airport, toward Washington, toward the life I built in the shadows while my family counted me among the disappeared. In the rearview mirror, Minneapolis fades to a distant glow. Behind me, Trevor is probably still standing in Dad's doorway, wine glass in hand, trying to solve a puzzle with pieces he never knew existed. He'll figure it out eventually. They all will. But not because I explained myself. I stopped doing that 23 years ago. The plane climbs through Minneapolis airspace, and I watch the city lights spread below like a constellation I helped build. 15 years of quiet work mapped out in shelter locations, housing developments, and community centers that most people drive past without noticing. I started with a ladle and a hairnet. 3 months after I withdrew from Harvard, I was serving soup at St. Stephen's downtown. Not because I wanted to save the world, that girl had died in the back seat of David Henderson's sedan. I volunteered because I needed to be around people who understood that survival wasn't guaranteed. That dignity wasn't dependent on degrees or press coverage or family approval. The shelter served 200 people a night, families with children who'd aged out of temporary housing, veterans whose benefits had run out, women fleeing situations that left them choosing between safety and stability. Everyone had a story. Most had learned, like me, that some stories were safer, left untold. Martha Williams ran the shelter with the efficiency of a military operation and the compassion of someone who'd needed shelter herself. She was the one who suggested I do more than serve food. "You've got education," she said, after watching me help a mother navigate the housing application process. "These people need someone who understands the system, someone who can translate bureaucracy into action." So I started staying after meals, helping with paperwork, making phone calls, learning which city council members actually returned calls, and which housing authorities had waiting lists that moved faster than others. The work was invisible, unglamorous, necessary. Within 6 months, I was spending 40 hours a week at the shelter. Within a year, I was writing grant proposals and coordinating with other nonprofits across the Twin Cities. Within 2 years, I'd identified patterns in housing policy that were creating bottlenecks for families transitioning out of homelessness. That's when I founded Second Shelter. The name came from Martha. First shelter keeps you alive, she said. Second shelter gets you home. I filed the paperwork under the name E.J. Waters, Elizabeth Jane Waters. My middle names and my grandmother's maiden name, professional distance disguised as personal privacy. The signature on documents looked official without being traceable to the Ward family dinner table. E.J. Waters could write policy briefs without explaining why she cared about housing reform. Could testify before city council without fielding questions about her background. Could build something substantial without becoming the story. The organization started small. A borrowed office in the basement of St. Stephen's. A volunteer coordinator who worked 3 days a week. A phone line that forwarded to my cell phone. But the work was precise, surgical. We didn't just provide temporary housing, we identified systemic gaps that kept families cycling through emergency services. We mapped resource networks. We documented policy failures and proposed solutions. Within 5 years, Second Shelter had helped over 3,000 families transition to permanent housing. We'd influenced zoning decisions in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Duluth. Housing authorities in Wisconsin and Iowa were adopting our assessment protocols. State legislators were citing our research in committee hearings. My name appeared on exactly 0 press releases. When reporters called, they were directed to Martha Williams, our public face and community liaison. When awards were offered, I declined through carefully worded letters signed by E.J. Waters. When speaking engagements were requested, I sent program directors who'd been trained in our methodologies. People called me the soup lady, I told Martha when she asked why I avoided public recognition. I didn't correct them, that was the point. The point was building something that mattered more than the person who built it. Creating change that survived regardless of who received credit. Proving that power didn't require a platform. The Public Health Service Commission came through a contact at the VA. Colonel Bradley Martinez, no relation to my former professor, was coordinating federal response to a housing crisis in Detroit. He'd heard about Second Shelter's work through policy circles, wanted to know if E.J. Waters might be interested in expanding her expertise to federal level. The commission offered something I'd never had official authority to implement change, the ability to coordinate resources across state lines, access to federal funding streams that could scale successful programs nationwide. I accepted the appointment as Evelyn J. Ward, my real name for official purposes, but within an organization that valued results over recognition. Where rank was earned through competence, not connections. The transition took 3 years. 3 years of medical training, leadership development, and policy immersion. 3 years of learning how to command respect through expertise rather than explanation. Colonel Ward specialized in emergency housing coordination, disaster response, community resilience planning, the kind of work that required someone who understood both policy theory and ground-level implementation. My assignments took me to hurricane zones, wildfire evacuation centers, and flood-damaged communities across the country. I coordinated temporary housing for thousands of displaced families, wrote protocols that became standard operating procedures for federal emergency response. But I never stayed for the press conferences, never appeared in the photographs when politicians toured recovery sites, never accepted invitations to speak at conferences about federal housing policy. E.J. Waters continued running Second Shelter remotely. Colonel Ward fulfilled her federal obligations with quiet efficiency. Evelyn Ward attended family dinners and brought homemade pie. 3 different names for 3 different worlds. 3 different ways of being useful without being seen. The work spoke for itself. Housing policies I'd influenced were reducing homelessness in major cities. Emergency response protocols I'd developed were saving lives during natural disasters. Programs I'd designed were being implemented by organizations that had never heard of E.J. Waters or Colonel Ward. Success measured not in recognition, but in results. Not in applause, but in impact. Not in being seen, but in seeing clearly enough to solve problems others couldn't identify. Martha Williams retired last year. At her farewell dinner, she pulled me aside. "You know they're going to figure it out eventually," she said. "All the work you've done, all the lives you've changed. Someone's going to connect the dots." I looked around the room at the shelter staff, the volunteers, the families whose children were now in permanent housing because of programs we'd built together. "Maybe," I said, "but by then it won't matter. The work will speak for itself." The plane banks east toward Washington, toward a meeting where for the first time in 15 years I'll be asked to speak as myself. Not as E.J. Waters or Colonel Ward or the soup lady. As the person who built something lasting while everyone else was looking elsewhere. The irony isn't lost on me. I spent 23 years learning to be invisible. Now I'm being summoned because someone finally noticed what I could see. The first time I saw Trevor's name on a city planning document, I thought it was a mistake. I was sitting in my basement office at Second Shelter reviewing the monthly development proposals that crossed my desk. Part of staying invisible meant staying informed, knowing which projects might affect our housing placements, which zoning changes could impact our partner organizations, which developers were worth watching. The proposal was buried on page 47 of the Municipal Planning Commission agenda. Ward Development LLC, Riverside Luxury Residences. Mixed-use development, 400 units, projected completion 2026. Ward Development. My brother's company, the one he'd launched 3 years ago with backing from Dad's old business contacts and a loan secured by the hardware store. The company that had made Trevor the family success story, the son who'd figured out how to build something lasting. I pulled up the property maps, traced the boundaries with my finger across the computer screen. The development footprint covered 6 city blocks along the Mississippi River, prime real estate, waterfront views, close to downtown but far enough from industrial areas to command premium prices. It also covered half of the Patterson Corridor. The Patterson Corridor wasn't its official name. City planners called it the Riverside Transitional Housing District. Developers called it underutilized riverfront property. But for the past 8 years, it had been the heart of Second Shelter's permanent housing program. 12 apartment buildings, 462 units, 318 families currently housed through our placement program. Children who walked to school from addresses that meant stability instead of uncertainty. Parents who could list permanent addresses on job applications. Families who'd moved from surviving to building. I spent the afternoon in my car driving through neighborhoods I'd helped create, stopping at buildings where E.J. Waters had coordinated lease agreements and Colonel Ward had secured federal funding for renovation projects. Mrs. Rodriguez was hanging laundry on the 3rd floor balcony at 847 Riverside Drive. Her daughter Maria was starting kindergarten next month, the first child in 3 generations to begin school from a permanent address. Mr. Thompson was teaching his grandson to ride a bike in the courtyard behind the Morrison building. The boy's mother was 6 months clean and working full-time at the medical center downtown. Stable housing had made stable recovery possible. The Jackson family was moving furniture into their new place at River's Edge Apartments. Their eviction notice had expired 2 years ago, but they'd been living in their car until Second Shelter found them permanent placement. Now they were arguing about where to put the television, the kind of normal family dispute that required having a living room. 318 families, 742 children, people who'd rebuilt their lives in spaces that my brother wanted to demolish for luxury condos. I drove back to City Hall and requested the full development proposal, 237 pages of architectural renderings, financial projections, and impact assessments. The kind of comprehensive planning that took months to prepare and millions to implement. The executive summary was signed by Trevor Ward, CEO and Development Director. He'd done his homework. Market analysis showed demand for high-end housing among young professionals working downtown. Environmental impact studies demonstrated minimal ecological disruption. Traffic pattern analysis suggested manageable increases in vehicle flow. But the housing displacement assessment was 3 paragraphs long. Current residential structures in the development area house approximately 300 low-income families in temporary transitional housing. Displacement will be managed through coordination with local housing authorities and relocation assistance programs. Affected residents will receive 90-day notice and referral services to comparable housing options. Comparable housing options. As if the 8 years of careful placement, community building, and stability creation could be replaced with referral services and 90-day notices. The proposal mentioned second shelter exactly once in a footnote about existing social services in the area. Various nonprofit organizations provide meal services and temporary assistance to area residents. Development will not significantly impact these services as they can be relocated to comparable facilities. Meal services, temporary assistance. 8 years of policy innovation and federal coordination reduced to soup kitchens and Band-Aid solutions. I called Martha Williams from the City Hall parking lot. "How long have you known?" she asked after I explained the situation. 3 hours. "What are you going to do, Iha?" I watched city employees leaving the building. 5 o'clock exodus of people who'd spent the day processing paperwork that determined where families could live, where children could attend school, whether communities survived or disappeared. "I'm going to the Planning Commission meeting," I said, as E.J. Waters. As someone who needs to understand what we're dealing with. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. Public comment period from 7 to 8 p.m., 3 minutes per speaker. Sign-up sheet available 30 minutes before the session began. I signed up as E.J. Waters, representing Second Shelter. Took a seat in the back row of the council chambers and waited for Trevor to present his proposal. He looked good, professional, confident. The kind of developer who'd done his homework and anticipated objections. He wore the navy suit Dad had bought him for his college graduation, the one that made him look like someone who belonged in boardrooms and city council meetings. His presentation lasted 20 minutes, architectural models, financial projections, job creation estimates, tax revenue increases, all the arguments that made development projects sound like community improvements instead of community displacement. During the question period, Council member Sarah Bennett asked about housing displacement. "We're talking about transitional housing," Trevor said. "Temporary placements that were always intended to be stepping stones to permanent residences. Our development actually creates more permanent housing options for the area. Permanent housing options that started at $3,000 per month. Luxury units with granite countertops and river views. Housing that would be permanent for young professionals, not for families transitioning out of homelessness." "What about the nonprofit services currently operating in the area?" Bennett asked. Trevor's smile was practiced, dismissive. "Look, I have tremendous respect for the work these organizations do, but we're talking about feel-good soup kitchens for lost causes. They can set up anywhere. Good intentions don't require prime real estate. Feel-good soup kitchens for lost causes. 8 years of policy development, federal coordination, municipal housing reform, programs that had influenced legislation in 5 states, work that had changed how cities approach transitional housing across the Midwest, reduced to soup kitchens for lost causes." I sat in the back row of the council chambers, watching my brother dismiss 15 years of my life as charity work that could be relocated to accommodate his profit margins. He didn't just ignore me, he bulldozed through me, the realization hit with the force of recognition. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't oversight. This was erasure with a business plan and municipal approval. Trevor knew about Second Shelter. He'd researched the area. He'd identified the organizations that would be displaced. He'd calculated the cost of relocation assistance and decided it was worth paying to clear the land. He'd looked at my work and decided it was disposable. The meeting ended at 8:30. Trevor packed up his presentation materials and shook hands with council members, backslapping. Congratulations. The kind of professional bonding that happened when everyone agreed that progress required removing obstacles. I waited until the chamber emptied. Then I walked to the front of the room and stood where Trevor had delivered his presentation. From that angle, I could see the entire room, the podium where he'd spoken, the council seats where decisions were made, the gallery where affected residents could watch their lives being debated and decided. In 6 months, if the proposal was approved, 318 families would receive 90-day notices. Children would change schools. Parents would lose addresses that meant stability. Communities would scatter. And Trevor would build luxury condos on the foundation of my life's work. I left City Hall and drove home through neighborhoods that might not exist by next Christmas. Past buildings where families were sleeping in beds they might have to leave. Past playgrounds where children were learning to feel safe in communities my brother wanted to demolish. The stakes had changed. This wasn't about family dynamics or personal recognition. This was about survival, about whether 15 years of careful building could be erased by someone who'd never bothered to understand what he was destroying. I had 6 months to save the work I'd built in silence. And for the first time in 23 years, silence wouldn't be enough. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Trevor's presentation to the Planning Commission. I was in the basement office at Second Shelter reviewing emergency placement requests and drinking coffee that had gone cold 2 hours earlier. The caller ID showed a Washington, D.C. number I didn't recognize. Government prefix. The kind of call that usually meant federal funding questions or compliance reviews. E.J. Waters, I answered using the voice I'd perfected over 15 years of nonprofit coordination. Professional but not bureaucratic. Accessible but not informal. Ms. Waters, this is Rebecca Martinez from the Domestic Policy Council. I'm calling about your housing model. I set down my coffee cup. The Domestic Policy Council didn't call nonprofit directors at 7 in the morning to discuss housing models. They sent emails, they requested reports, they scheduled meetings through proper channels. Which model specifically, I asked, though I already knew. There was only one program that had gained enough attention to warrant a call from the White House. The Second Shelter Integration Protocol. Your approach to transitional housing has been cited in policy briefs from HUD, the VA, and the Department of Health and Human Services. We've been tracking implementation across multiple states. Tracking implementation, the phrase carried weight that made my chest tighten. When federal agencies tracked programs, it meant someone at the highest levels was paying attention. We'd like you to participate in a closed briefing on emergency housing reforms, Martinez continued. The president is convening a working group to address the national housing crisis. Your expertise would be valuable. The president, not the president's staff, not the housing committee, the president. When I asked. This Sunday, transport will be arranged. We'll need you in Washington by 1400 hours. Sunday, 4 days from now. 4 days to prepare for a meeting I'd spent 15 years avoiding. Ms. Martinez, I said carefully, I appreciate the invitation, but I'm not typically involved in policy discussions at this level. I'm operational, not strategic. Ms. Waters. Her voice shifted, became more direct. Your operational work has influenced strategic policy across 5 states. The Detroit Emergency Housing Response, your protocols. The Milwaukee Transitional Housing Initiative, your model. The federal disaster housing standards that went into effect last year. Your recommendations, I knew all of this. Had written the reports, coordinated the implementations, watched policies I'd developed get adopted by organizations that had never heard of E.J. Waters. You've been strategic, Martinez continued. You've just been strategic without a platform. The president wants to change that. Without a platform. The phrase captured 15 years of deliberate invisibility, of building influence through competence rather than exposure. This briefing, I said. What would be expected of me? Honest assessment of current federal housing policy, recommendations for emergency response improvements, input on resource allocation strategies. She paused. For once, we want you to appear in uniform, not behind the scenes. In uniform, as Colonel Ward, not E.J. Waters. As the federal officer who'd coordinated disaster housing response, not the nonprofit director who served soup and filed paperwork. You want me to speak as Colonel Ward? No, Martinez said. We want the woman who did all this without a podium. The woman who did all this without a podium. The acknowledgement hit like recognition after decades of anonymity. Someone in Washington understood that the work mattered more than the worker, that solutions could emerge from basement offices and shelter kitchens, that leadership didn't require a stage. I looked around the basement office, file cabinets filled with placement records, maps showing housing locations across the Twin Cities, photographs of families who'd moved from emergency shelter to permanent addresses, evidence of 15 years spent building something that mattered. Ms. Waters, Martinez's voice pulled me back to the phone call. Will you join us? The word yes sat in my throat, heavy with implications. Saying yes meant stepping into visibility, meant connecting E.J. Waters to Colonel Ward, to Evelyn Ward, in ways that couldn't be undone. It meant the end of invisibility as a strategy, but it also meant the beginning of visibility as a tool. A way to protect the work that Trevor wanted to demolish. A way to ensure that policies I'd developed could survive beyond basement offices and borrowed conference rooms. Yes, I said. I'll be there. Excellent. Transportation details will be forwarded within the hour. One more thing, Ms. Waters. This briefing is classified. The attendee list is restricted. You'll need to maintain confidentiality until further notice. Confidentiality, the final irony. After 15 years of voluntary silence, I was being asked to maintain official silence about the invitation that would end my invisibility. Understood, I said. Thank you, Ms. Waters. The president is looking forward to meeting the woman behind the second shelter model. The line went dead. I sat in my basement office, coffee-cold morning light filtering through small windows that looked out at ground level. In 4 days, I would be in Washington, in uniform, speaking to the President of the United States about work I'd done without credit or recognition. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 23 years, I'd avoided family dinners, where success was measured by visibility. Now I was being summoned to the highest level of government because of work nobody knew I was doing. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Martha Williams's number. She answered on the second ring. Martha, it's Evelyn. I need you to cover the shelter this weekend. Emergency. The opposite, I said. I'm finally being asked to explain what we've built. There was silence on the other end. Then, about damn time. About damn time. After 15 years of building in shadows, someone wanted to see the blueprint. But first I had to survive a family dinner where they'd never understand why I was leaving early. Trevor's new house smells like fresh paint and success. Hardwood floors that gleam under recessed lighting. Kitchen island big enough to seat 8 people. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river, the same river where his development will displace 300 families. Isn't it beautiful, blah? Mom asks, running her hand along the granite countertop. Trevor worked so hard for this. The dinner is a celebration. Trevor's development deal cleared the final planning commission hurdle on Thursday. Groundbreaking scheduled for next month. The Ward family's newest success story worthy of champagne and congratulations. I brought wine. A bottle of Malbec that cost more than most families in the Patterson corridor spend on groceries in a week. The kind of gesture that says, I'm happy for you without requiring actual words. Evelyn, Trevor greets me at the door with the enthusiasm of someone who's forgotten every cruel comment he's ever made. I'm so glad you could make it. I'm wearing the same outfit I wore to Dad's birthday dinner 3 months ago. Jeans, flannel shirt, boots that have walked through every housing placement in the city. The uniform of someone who's given up trying to impress people who stopped looking years ago. The dining room table is set with Trevor's new china, wedding gifts from his marriage to Sarah, the real estate attorney who helped him navigate the municipal approval process. She's setting out appetizers and talking about the housewarming party they're planning for next month. The view will be even better once the construction is finished, she says, gesturing toward the windows. All that transitional housing will be gone. Just luxury condos and riverfront walking paths. All that transitional housing. 8 years of careful placement. Families who'd found stability. Children who'd learned what permanent addresses meant. Reduced to visual obstruction. Dad raises his glass. To Trevor. For seeing opportunity where others saw problems. Others saw problems. The others being nonprofit directors who thought housing people was more important than river views. The others being social workers who measured success in stable families, not profit margins. The others being me. Speech, Claire calls out, and everyone turns to Trevor with expectant faces. He stands wineglass in hand, looking every inch the successful developer. The son who'd made good. The brother who'd figured out how to build something valuable. I want to thank everyone for believing in this project, he says, for understanding that sometimes you have to clear away the old to make room for the new. Clear away the old. The old being Mrs. Rodriguez's laundry line, Mr. Thompson's courtyard where his grandson learned to ride a bike, the Jackson family's first permanent address in 5 years. There were people who said it couldn't be done, Trevor continues. People who said we should preserve the area as is, but progress requires vision. It requires the courage to say that prime real estate shouldn't be wasted on temporary solutions. Temporary solutions. 15 years of policy development, federal coordination, municipal housing reform that had influenced legislation across 5 states. temporary solutions that could be cleared away for better views. What about the families who live there, I ask. The question stops Trevor mid-sentence. He looks at me with the expression he's worn since we were children, surprised that I spoke, mildly, annoyed that I interrupted. They'll be relocated, he says. 90-day notice, relocation assistance. They'll find other places. Other places. As if stability was transferable. As if community was replaceable. As if 8 years of careful placement could be undone with relocation assistance and good intentions. Through which organizations, I ask. I don't know the details, Trevor says, irritation creeping into his voice. There are social services, nonprofits, feel-good soup kitchens that can help them figure it out. Feel-good soup kitchens. The phrase hits the same way it did in the council chambers. Dismissive. Reductive. Designed to minimize work he'd never bothered to understand. Like second shelter, I ask. Sure, Trevor says, waving his hand. Whatever. The point is there are resources. These people will be fine. These people will be fine. The Mrs. Rodriguez's and Mr. Thompson's and Jackson families. The 742 children who'd learned what permanent addresses meant. The 318 families who'd built lives in spaces Trevor wanted to demolish. They'll be fine because Trevor said so. The doorbell rings. Sarah frowns. We're not expecting anyone. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I can see the black SUV in the driveway. Government plates, tinted windows, the same kind of vehicle that had pulled up to Dad's house 3 months ago. Trevor opens the door and I watch his face change, watch the confident developer expression dissolve into confusion. 2 agents stand on his doorstep. Dark suits, earpieces, professional courtesy mixed with official authority. We're looking for Colonel Ward, the taller agent says. There's no Colonel Ward here, Trevor says, looking back at the dinner table. This is a private residence. Sir, our records indicate Colonel Evelyn Ward is at this address. Evelyn Ward, my name spoken with the kind of respect that comes from rank and recognition. The name that appears on federal housing policy documents and emergency response protocols. The name that has never appeared on Trevor's radar. I stand up from the dinner table, walk toward the door with the calm that comes from 15 years of official responsibility. Colonel Ward, the shorter agent says, relief evident in his voice. We're ready for your transport. The President expects your briefing by 2100 hours. The President expects your briefing. The words hang in the air like a revelation, like the punchline to a joke that's been building for 23 years. The silence is complete. Not the polite pause from Dad's birthday dinner, but the kind of silence that follows explosions. The kind of silence that accompanies the complete reconstruction of reality. Dad stands frozen wine glass halfway to his lips. His mouth closes, opens again. No words emerge. Trevor's wine glass slips from his hand. Crystal hits hardwood with the sound of something expensive breaking. Red wine spreads across the floor like spilled secrets, staining the success he'd been celebrating. Claire's hand covers her mouth, but I can see her eyes calculating, trying to reconcile the sister she'd dismissed with the colonel being summoned to brief the president. Mom grips the kitchen island like it might steady a world that just shifted off its axis. But it's Grandma who speaks first. Grandma who's been crying quietly since the agents appeared. You're the one they were talking about, she whispers, her voice breaking. In the paper, the housing expert. The one who saved all those families during the flooding in Louisiana. The one who saved all those families. The work that had made headlines without my name attached. The emergency response coordination that had been attributed to federal agencies, instead of the colonel who'd designed the protocols. I look at Trevor, who's staring at me like I'm a stranger who just walked into his dining room wearing his sister's face. Give me 2 minutes, I tell the agents. They nod and step back. Professional courtesy. They've done this before. I turn back to my family. To the celebration that's become a reckoning. To the dinner table where success had been measured in real estate deals and profit margins. Thank you for dinner, I say, my voice, carrying the same calm I've used in disaster zones and emergency briefings. The wine was excellent. I walk toward the door, toward the SUV, toward the meeting where I'll finally speak about work I've done without credit or recognition. Behind me, I hear Trevor's voice, small and confused. What the hell just happened? But I'm already walking away from the life they thought they knew, walking toward the life I built while they weren't looking. The agents close the door behind me, and I don't look back at the house with the river views and the granite countertops and the wine stains on the hardwood floors. Some silences are worth breaking. The flight back to Minneapolis cuts through darkness at 30,000 feet. Below, cities spread like circuit boards, each light representing lives I'll never know. Above, stars that have watched civilizations rise and fall with the same indifference my family showed my disappearance. The briefing lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of explaining protocols I'd developed in basement offices to officials who'd implemented them without knowing their origin. 6 hours of watching the president take notes while I outlined solutions to problems his administration had been struggling to solve. Colonel Ward, he'd said at the end, "Your work has saved more lives than most people realize. We need to change that. Most people realize." The phrase carried implications that extended far beyond federal housing policy. It suggested recognition, publicity, the kind of visibility I'd spent 15 years avoiding. But sitting in the plane flying back to a family that had just learned I existed, I found myself thinking about a different kind of visibility, the kind that gets erased instead of earned. The thought led me to my phone, to the storage unit I'd rented 5 years ago when I cleaned out my childhood bedroom, to the box of papers I'd saved because throwing them away felt like admitting defeat. I'd scheduled a stop at the storage facility before going home. Some questions could only be answered by looking at evidence I'd tried to forget. The box sits in Unit 47B beneath my college textbooks and behind a filing cabinet full of early second shelter documents. 23 years of accumulated paper, letters from universities, award notifications, speaking invitations, all the recognition I'd stopped receiving after I withdrew from Harvard. I find the first letter buried beneath congratulations I'd never opened. University of Minnesota Office of Alumni Affairs, dated 3 months after I'd left school. The letter had formal, the tone apologetic. "Dear Ms. Ward, we received a request from your father regarding your inclusion in our Honor Society recognition materials. Per his instructions, we have removed your name from our alumni publications and speaking engagement lists. We respect your family's wishes regarding privacy during this difficult transition." Difficult transition. As if sexual assault was a career change instead of a crime. As if requesting removal from Honor Society lists was standard family crisis management. I flipped through the box. More letters, more removals, more evidence of systematic erasure disguised as family protection. The Harvard Kennedy School Alumni Association. "We understand from your father that you've chosen an unaccredited path and prefer not to be associated with our institution." The Urban Planning Institute. "Your father has requested that we remove you from our distinguished graduate database, the National Honor Society. Per your family's request, we have removed your name from our notable alumni records. Every letter signed by Dad. Every request justified as family preference. Every erasure presented as protection from embarrassment. The pattern becomes clear as I read through years of correspondence. Every opportunity withdrawn. Every recognition rescinded. Every invitation revoked. Not because I'd failed. Because someone had decided failure was a better story than the truth. The worst letter sits at the bottom of the box. Lincoln High School Alumni Association. Dated 5 years ago. The handwriting on the envelope familiar. Trevor's handwriting. "To whom it may concern, I am writing to request the removal of my sister, Evelyn Ward, from the Lincoln High School Alumni Wall of Achievement. While she was an excellent student, her post-graduation choices have not reflected the values or achievements we typically celebrate. Her lack of professional contribution and inability to establish meaningful career accomplishments make her inclusion inappropriate for a display meant to inspire current students. I believe her removal would be in the best interest of both the school and our family's reputation. Lack of professional contribution, inability to establish meaningful career accomplishments. The words burn like acid on paper. This letter was written while I was coordinating emergency housing response for hurricane survivors in Louisiana, while my protocols were being implemented by FEMA, while federal agencies were adopting policies I'd developed to save lives during natural disasters. Trevor had petitioned my high school to remove my name from the alumni wall while I was literally saving lives. I close the box and sit in the storage unit surrounded by evidence of 23 years of systematic erasure. Not neglect, not oversight. Deliberate action designed to ensure my achievements remained invisible. They didn't forget me, they scrubbed me. The realization hits with the force of understanding. Every missed opportunity, every uninvited event, every moment when I'd wondered why recognition never came, it wasn't because my work didn't matter. It was because someone had decided it shouldn't be seen. My phone buzzes. Text message from Martha Williams. Saw the news. Washington Post is running a story about the mystery housing expert who briefed the president. They're calling you the woman who saved disaster response. Figured you should know before it hits the morning papers. The woman who saved disaster response. After 15 years of invisibility, 24 hours of visibility was about to change everything. I drive home through empty streets, past the neighborhoods where I'd placed families, past the buildings where policies I'd written had created stability, past the life I'd built while my family was actively erasing evidence that I'd ever existed. The apartment is dark when I arrive. No messages on the answering machine. No missed calls from family members who'd just learned their daughter and sister was briefing the president while they were celebrating real estate deals. But there's an envelope under my door. Dad's handwriting on cream-colored stationery, the same kind he'd used for business correspondence at the hardware store. Evelyn, we need to talk. There are things you don't understand about the decisions we made, things we did to protect you. Please call when you're ready to listen. To protect me. The phrase that had justified 23 years of erasure. The explanation that transformed systematic removal into family care. I think about Mrs. Rodriguez, hanging laundry on her balcony. About Mr. Thompson teaching his grandson to ride a bike. About the Jackson family arguing over television placement in their first permanent living room. I think about the 742 children who learned what stable addresses meant because of policies I'd developed in basement offices, while my family was petitioning schools to remove my name from honor rolls. I think about the president taking notes while I explained solutions to problems his administration couldn't solve. And I think about Trevor's wine glass hitting the hardwood floor when he learned that the sister he'd dismissed was the colonel who'd briefed the president. The letter from Dad sits on my kitchen table, unopened. Some conversations require preparation. Some truths require courage. Tomorrow the Washington Post story will run. Tomorrow E.J. Waters and Colonel Ward will become Evelyn Ward in ways that can't be undone. Tomorrow 15 years of invisible work will become visible. But tonight I sit in my apartment surrounded by evidence of erasure and prepare for the conversation that will determine whether 23 years of silence was enough. Some wounds heal in darkness. Others require light to close properly. I reach for my phone to call Dad back. It's time to stop protecting people who never tried to protect me. The National Housing Summit convenes in the Ronald Reagan Building 3 blocks from the White House. 2,000 attendees, senators and activists, HUD officials and nonprofit directors, housing advocates who've spent careers fighting for recognition of work that happens in shelters and community centers across America. I stand backstage in my dress uniform, watching the audience through a gap in the curtains. Senator Patricia Coleman is introducing the keynote speakers. Housing Secretary Michael Rodriguez sits in the front row reviewing notes. Camera crews position themselves for optimal coverage of what the program calls a new vision for American housing policy. The uniform feels different today, heavier. Not because of the rank insignia or the ribbons marking 15 years of federal service, but because of what it represents. The convergence of Colonel Ward and E.J. Waters and Evelyn Ward into a single person standing on a national stage. Colonel Ward. Rebecca Martinez appears beside me, the same aide who'd called 3 weeks ago. You're on in 5 minutes. 5 minutes. 15 years of invisible work about to become visible in ways that can't be undone. The audience has been briefed on your background, Martinez continues. Your housing model, your disaster response coordination, the policies you've influenced. They know they're hearing from someone who's changed how America houses its most vulnerable populations. Someone who's changed how America houses its most vulnerable populations. The recognition I'd never asked for describing work I'd done without seeking credit. Through the curtain gap, I can see the audience, policymakers and practitioners, people who'd implemented programs I'd designed, officials who'd signed legislation based on research I'd conducted in basement offices. Some of them knew the work, none of them knew the worker. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Coleman's voice carries through the sound system. Please welcome Colonel Evelyn Ward, architect of the Second Shelter Model and coordinator of federal emergency housing response. architect of the second shelter model, the words hit like recognition after decades of anonymity, like vindication after years of erasure. I walk onto the stage and 2,000 people rise to their feet. Not polite applause, but the kind of ovation reserved for people whose work has changed lives. The kind of recognition that comes from results, not relationships. The podium feels solid beneath my hands, real, grounding. I look out at faces that represent every aspect of housing policy in America. People who fought the same battles I fought, often without knowing we were allies. Thank you, I say, and the applause fades to attentive silence. My name is Colonel Evelyn Ward. For the past 15 years, I've worked to ensure that American families have access to safe, stable housing. Not because housing is a policy issue, but because housing is a human right. The words carry through the auditorium with the weight of conviction earned through practice, through placing families, through coordinating emergency response, through writing policies that turned bureaucratic processes into pathways home. I want to share something with you today that I've never shared publicly, I continue. For most of my adult life, people have asked me what I do for work. Family members have suggested I was unemployed. Friends have recommended job opportunities. Well-meaning relatives have wondered when I'd find my purpose. I pause, scanning faces in the audience. Policymakers who've dedicated careers to housing advocacy. Activists who fought for funding and recognition. People who understand what it means to be dismissed while doing essential work. I was never unemployed. I was building what you refuse to count. The silence is complete. 2,000 people holding their breath, waiting for the explanation that will connect invisible work to visible impact. I founded Second Shelter under the name E. J. Waters because I learned early that solutions mattered more than credit, that policy changes mattered more than policymakers, that helping families find permanent housing mattered more than helping journalists find quotable sources. I think about Mrs. Rodriguez, hanging laundry on her balcony, about Mr. Thompson teaching his grandson to ride a bike, about the Jackson family's first permanent address in 5 years. Over 15 years, this approach allowed me to influence housing policy across 5 states, to coordinate federal disaster response, to develop protocols that have housed thousands of families during emergencies, to write legislation that's been implemented by organizations that never heard my name. In the front row, Housing Secretary Rodriguez leans forward, taking notes. Behind him, Senator Coleman nods with the recognition of someone who's fought similar battles for institutional change. You didn't need to know my name, but now you will remember what I stood for. The words hang in the air like a promise, like the conclusion to a story that's been building for 15 years. Housing policy isn't about buildings. It's about stability. It's about children who can attend the same school for an entire year. It's about parents who can list permanent addresses on job applications. It's about communities that form when people have places to belong. I think about Trevor's development proposal, about 300 families who will receive 90-day notices if luxury condos matter more than stable communities. When we treat housing as a commodity instead of a foundation, we create crisis. When we value profit over people, we destroy communities. When we measure success by economic development instead of human development, we lose sight of why we build in the first place. The audience is completely still. Policymakers and activists, united in recognition of truths they've fought to articulate for years. The Second Shelter model works because it treats housing as a pathway, not a destination. Because it recognizes that stability creates possibility. Because it understands that the strongest communities are built by people who've learned the value of home through its absence. I pause, thinking about the storage unit full of letters, about 23 years of systematic erasure, about the conversation with Dad that I'd postponed until after this speech. Some of you have asked how this model remained hidden for so long, how significant policy innovations could emerge without academic recognition or media coverage. The answer is simple. I chose invisibility because I thought it was safer than visibility. I thought solutions mattered more than the person who created them. My voice carries the weight of recognition, of understanding gained through experience. I was wrong, not about the solutions they work, but about the importance of being seen. Because when good work remains invisible, it can be ignored. When effective policies have no public advocate, they can be dismantled. When communities are built by people, no one knows they can be destroyed by people everyone recognizes. I think about Trevor's wine glass hitting the hardwood floor, about the moment when invisibility became impossible to maintain. Visibility isn't about credit. It's about protection. It's about ensuring that work worth doing continues to be done. It's about making sure that solutions survive the people who create them. The silence stretches heavy with implication. 2,000 people processing the story of work, done without recognition policy, created without platforms change, implemented without stages. Today I'm asking you to remember not my name, but what it represents. The thousands of people working in shelters and community centers. The nonprofit directors writing grants in basement offices. The caseworkers placing families one at a time. The volunteers serving soup and building communities. I step back from the podium, but the audience remains silent, waiting. They deserve to be seen. Their work deserves protection, and their solutions deserve implementation, not because they're perfect, but because they're born from practice, from daily contact with the problems policy is meant to solve. I nod to the audience. Thank you. The ovation starts slowly. Housing Secretary Rodriguez rising to his feet. Senator Coleman applauding with the enthusiasm of someone who's found unexpected alliance. Then the entire auditorium, 2,000 people standing in recognition of work that changes lives without seeking credit. The applause continues for 3 minutes, long enough for camera crews to capture footage that will lead evening news broadcasts. Long enough for reporters to draft headlines about the colonel who built housing policy in silence. As I leave the stage, I hear Rebecca Martinez speaking into her phone. Yes, we need to update the press release. The headline should read, "The Shelter Colonel from Silence to Summit." From silence to summit. The journey that began in a basement office and ended on a national stage with stops at family dinners, where success was measured by visibility rather than impact. But this isn't the end. It's the beginning of visibility as a tool instead of a threat, of recognition as protection instead of exposure, the beginning of being undeniable. The Minneapolis airport terminal buzzes with ordinary life, travelers checking phones, families reuniting business people, wheeling luggage toward rental car counters, normal people living normal lives that don't include briefing presidents or delivering speeches to housing summits. I'm still in uniform. The same dress blues I wore on the podium 12 hours ago when 2,000 people rose to their feet in recognition of work they'd never known existed. The same uniform that will be photographed for tomorrow's newspapers, when the shelter colonel becomes a headline instead of a secret. Trevor is waiting by baggage claim. He looks smaller than he did at the dinner party, less certain. The confident developer who dismissed nonprofits as soup kitchens for lost causes has been replaced by someone who spent 3 days watching his sister become national news. Evelyn, he says when he sees me approach. His voice carries the careful tone of someone who's rehearsed this conversation multiple times. I need to talk to you. I nod toward the parking garage. Some conversations require privacy even when they change nothing. We walk in silence past concrete pillars and fluorescent lights, past the kind of institutional architecture that houses necessary functions without pretending to be beautiful. The garage smells like exhaust and winter salt, like the ordinary infrastructure that keeps cities functioning. Trevor's car is parked on level 3, a black Lexus that costs more than most families spend on housing in 2 years. The kind of vehicle that announces success to people who measure worth by what they can see and price. I saw the speech, he says, not making eye contact, on CNN. They replayed it 3 times during the morning broadcast. 3 times. The words I'd spoken once becoming a message that would reach millions of people. Recognition multiplied through media attention I'd spent 15 years avoiding. I didn't know, Trevor continues, about the work you were doing, about the lives you'd changed, about any of it. The admission hangs between us like an apology that doesn't quite apologize, like recognition that arrives 23 years too late to matter. I reach into my briefcase and pull out the zoning map I'd printed before leaving Washington. The same map I'd studied 3 weeks ago when I first learned about his development proposal. Red lines marking the Patterson corridor, blue dots showing housing placements, green shading indicating federal funding zones. This is what you are erasing, I say, handing him the map. These are names, not stats. Trevor takes the paper with hands that shake slightly, hands that sign development contracts without understanding what they were destroying. He stares at the dots and lines that represent 8 years of careful community building. Mrs. Rodriguez, I say, pointing to a blue dot at 847 Riverside Drive. Widowed 3 years ago. Daughter starting kindergarten next month. First stable address in 4 years. My finger moves to another dot. Mr. Thompson, Vietnam veteran, teaching his grandson to ride a bike in the courtyard behind Morrison Building. 68 years old. First permanent housing in a decade. Another dot. The Jackson family. Mother 6 months clean. Father working full-time at the medical center. 2 children who've learned what permanent addresses mean. Trevor's face changes as I speak, the confident developer expression dissolving into something that looks like understanding, like recognition of the gap between what he thought he was doing and what he was actually destroying. 318 families, I continue, 742 children, people whose lives you measured in 90-day notices and relocation assistance. He looks up from the map. I can stop the development. The offer comes quickly, desperately, the kind of solution that seems simple when you're trying to undo damage that's already been done. It's too late, I say. Contracts have been signed. Permits approved. Investors committed. Your luxury condos will be built. Trevor's shoulders slump. Then what do I do? What do I do? The question that comes after recognition. After understanding that success built on other people's erasure isn't success at all. You learn, I say. You remember what this felt like, and you never let it happen again. We stand in the parking garage, brother and sister, separated by 23 years of misunderstanding and 3 weeks of revelation. The gap between who he thought I was and who I'd always been. Evelyn, he says finally. I'm sorry, the apology is real. Late, but real. The kind of recognition that changes nothing but acknowledges everything. I know, I say, because I do know. I know he's sorry. I know he didn't understand. I know he would have made different choices if he'd known who he was erasing. But I also know that ignorance was a choice. That 23 years of dismissal wasn't accidental. That treating your sister like a failure requires deliberately not looking at evidence to the contrary. Will you forgive me, he asks? Forgiveness. The currency that's supposed to heal wounds and restore relationships. The expectation that understanding should lead to reconciliation. I don't need to forgive you, I say. I need you to remember this conversation the next time you decide someone's work doesn't matter. The distinction is important. Forgiveness suggests I'm carrying resentment that needs to be released, but I'm not angry anymore. I'm just finished pretending that being family means accepting dismissal as love. I walk toward my car, leaving Trevor standing beside his Lexus with the zoning map in his hands, with evidence of the community he'd chosen to destroy and the sister he'd never bothered to see. Behind me, I hear him call my name, but I don't turn around. Some conversations end with words. Others end with understanding. Others end with the recognition that some distances can't be closed by apologies. The drive home takes me through the Patterson corridor, past buildings where families are sleeping in beds they might have to leave, past playgrounds where children are learning to feel safe in communities that might not survive the spring. In my rearview mirror, the airport grows smaller. Behind me, a brother finally seeing the sister he'd erased. Ahead of me, a community that might be saved by visibility instead of silence. Dad's car is parked in my driveway when I arrive home. He's sitting on the front steps waiting. The conversation that's been postponed for 3 days, delayed by presidential briefings and housing summits and media interviews. But I'm ready now. Ready for the conversation that will determine whether 23 years of silence was enough. He looks up when I approach, opens his mouth to speak. I hand him my house key and walk past him into the house that I built while he was trying to erase me. Some conversations require words. Others require the recognition that words are no longer necessary. 6 months later, Lincoln High School calls to invite me to the alumni wall dedication ceremony. The same wall Trevor had petitioned to have my name removed from 5 years earlier. The same recognition he'd argued I didn't deserve because of my lack of professional contribution. The irony isn't lost on me, but irony I've learned is often justice wearing a patient smile. The ceremony is scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in November, the kind of gray Minneapolis day when early winter light filters through classroom windows, like promise wrapped in possibility. I park in the visitor's lot and walk through halls that smell like floor wax and teenage ambition. Principal Janet Morrison meets me at the main entrance. She's younger than I expected, with the kind of energy that comes from believing education can change the world. The kind of optimism I'd lost at 22 and found again at 45. "Colonel Ward," she says, extending her hand, "we're honored to have you here. Your story has inspired our entire community." My story, as if 23 years of systematic erasure and gradual recognition could be reduced to narrative. As if the complexity of building something meaningful while remaining invisible could be summarized in ceremony and bronze plaques. But stories matter, especially stories that show young people that success doesn't require applause. That contribution doesn't require recognition. That building something lasting matters more than being seen building it. The alumni wall spans the entire East Corridor, bronze plaques arranged chronologically documenting 70 years of graduates who'd made significant contributions to their communities. Doctors and teachers, engineers and entrepreneurs, local leaders who'd turned education into impact. My plaque sits in the class of 2000 section between Marcus Thompson founded 3 charter schools in Minneapolis, and Sarah Chen pioneered sustainable agriculture in rural Minnesota. The placement is accurate even if the timeline is complicated. The engraving is simple: Evelyn Ward, built without applause, founder Second Shelter nonprofit organization. Federal Housing Policy Coordinator, Emergency Response Specialist. Architect of transitional housing models implemented across 15 states. Built without applause. The phrase captures 15 years of deliberate invisibility better than any detailed biography could. The recognition that some of the most important work happens in basement offices and shelter kitchens and policy meetings and emergency response centers in places where cameras don't go and headlines don't reach. The inscription was suggested by our student council, Principal Morrison explains. They researched your career and felt it captured something essential about leadership. Student council, teenagers who'd understood what adults had missed for decades. That applause wasn't the measure of achievement. That contribution didn't require a stage. After the dedication ceremony, I drive across town to Metropolitan State University, the same campus where I'd started teaching a seminar in civic innovation 3 months earlier. Building Change Without Stages, a class that explores how effective leaders create impact through competence rather than charisma. The classroom is small, 12 students, young people who'd chosen public service over profit, who'd decided that solving problems mattered more than receiving credit for solutions. The kind of students who reminded me why education mattered, why sharing knowledge was as important as acquiring it. Today's discussion focuses on sustainable leadership, how to build organizations that survive their founders, how to create change that doesn't depend on individual recognition or institutional approval. Professor Ward Einreichenhart asks Jessica Martinez, a junior studying urban planning, what if the people closest to you never understand your work? What if your family never sees you for who you are? The question hangs in the air like recognition, like the acknowledgement that some of the hardest battles are fought not against strangers, but against people who claim to love you while refusing to see you. I think about Dad, who'd waited on my front steps for a conversation that never came, who'd called 16 times in 6 months, leaving voicemails that started with apology and ended with confusion, who couldn't understand why recognition didn't automatically restore relationships that had been broken by erasure. I think about Trevor, who'd sent flowers after the housing summit, who'd called to congratulate me on the federal appointment I'd received last month. Senior Advisor for Emergency Housing Policy, reporting directly to the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, who was trying to rebuild a bridge he'd spent years burning. I think about Mom, who'd framed the Washington Post article about the shelter colonel and hung it in the kitchen next to pictures of Trevor's real estate awards and Claire's family photos. Recognition arriving 23 years late, displayed beside achievements that had never been questioned. Then you lead anyway, I say, looking at Jessica and the 11 other students who'd chosen purpose over recognition. Because leadership isn't about being seen. It's about what happens when you show up. The words carry the weight of experience, of 15 years spent building something meaningful, while family members measured success by visibility, of learning that the most important work often happens when nobody's watching, when nobody's keeping score, when nobody's planning to give you credit. Real leadership, I continue, is what you do when the cameras are off, when the headlines move on to other stories, when the applause fades and you're left with the choice between continuing the work or waiting for the next round of recognition. Maria Santos, a senior in social work, raises her hand. But doesn't everyone need validation? Don't we all want our contributions to be acknowledged? Validation, the hunger that had driven me to seek family approval for decades. The need that had kept me attending dinners where I was dismissed, hoping that explanation might lead to understanding. We do, I say. But validation comes in different forms. It comes from the mother who finds permanent housing for her children, from the veteran who finally has an address that means stability, from the policymaker who implements programs that save lives. I gesture toward the window where November light illuminates a campus full of students preparing to change the world in ways that might never make headlines. It comes from knowing that what you built will survive long after people forget who built it, that the solutions matter more than the solver, that impact outlasts recognition. The class ends with the kind of silence that follows understanding. Students packing notebooks filled with ideas about building change, without stages about leading through competence rather than charisma, about measuring success, by lives improved rather than credit received. As they file out, Jessica stops at my desk. Professor Ward, she says, thank you for showing us that we don't need permission to make a difference. Permission, the thing I'd waited 23 years to receive before realizing I'd never needed it in the first place. No, I say you don't. You just need courage to show up. Everything else is just noise. I drive home through neighborhoods where families are living in stability I helped create. Past buildings where policies I wrote have become pathways home for people who might never know my name. The bronze plaque at Lincoln High School will outlast everyone who attended today's ceremony. The students in my classroom will carry lessons about leadership into careers that might change how America houses its most vulnerable populations. And somewhere in Minneapolis, families are sleeping safely because someone chose to build something meaningful without waiting for applause. Leadership isn't about being seen. It's about what happens when you show up. The rest is just noise.